This is Dr. Parikh recording about how to do the APA paper template for PS 207, if I can find it. Oh, I might have ended the recording already. Crap. Oh no, it's going. Good. All right. So again, the title page, most people did okay on. If there was an issue, it was usually because this margin, this running head, was too far down, and that happens especially if you're using Google Docs. I did find out that Google Docs does have a running head, does have like a header space. I don't think they used to, but they have that now. So you can probably, they've probably gotten to where you can format everything you need for this paper in Google Docs. Which did not used to be the case. Pages, I don't think they let you do a different first page. As of last spring, as of last fall, they didn't let you do that. So also, again, it's fairly basic, but it's easy to overlook. The first page says running head. The next page on says the title of article. Remember to double check your font, especially with a Mac. For some reason, the way the Macs insert numbers, it likes to go to its default font, even if you have Times New Roman already in the space. So check the font, make sure that your number is over somewhere, sort of either an inch and a quarter or an inch from the right part of the page. If it's over further, usually you've got an extra tab in there that you need to delete. Your title, name, university, that usually goes pretty well. Everyone good with the title page? Okay. The abstract. So one of the big things, it's supposed to be between 150 and 250 words. And I had said I wasn't going to be really stickler on it. I think in the future, I'm going to just say it has to be that because I got a lot of ones that are like 110 words, 120 words, and that's a pretty big difference. If it's 135 words, I'm not too concerned. So the abstract should be a summary of your whole article. Each of the articles you have came with an abstract. You usually read that first. And it tells sort of a little bit about the background, just a little bit. And then for the ones that are empirical articles or studies, it tells you things like how many people were there, often where they were recruited or if they were men or women. So it'll tell you a little bit, a snapshot of the sample, and it'll tell you a snapshot of the findings. So you're not doing a sample or findings. And so I think a lot of people, they wrote their themes, they kind of wrote it to match the other overview paragraphs, and then they just kind of stopped. If you need more space to fill your abstract, it's a good idea to include, again, emphasize whatever your thesis is, whatever you're concluding from this body of research. And then also, you can talk a little bit about your limitations, practical applications, and future research. Because again, this isn't a murder mystery. You're not trying to save a surprise ending. You're really trying to set the reader up. You're making a logical argument, and it's easier for me to follow a logical argument if I know what the conclusion's supposed to be. It's easier for me to absorb the information. Keywords, so abstract is another place where the formatting got off for a few people. Again, the best way I know how to write these things is to have a template or a sample or something up to compare your paper to. Make sure they look the same in terms of where it's indented, where it's not, where it's capitalized, where it's not, things like that. Any questions about the abstract? Okay. So the first page, you have your title repeated right at the top, and it's not bold. For APA, so the title, it's sort of like the section head of this section of your paper. So you've got your abstract, which has a section head, and you've got your references. Those like section heads don't get bolded. I don't know why, but they don't. So the title, not bold. And then you have an introduction paragraph. And this paragraph is supposed to still be somewhat broad, but it's a repetition of your themes. It's going to sound fairly similar to your abstract. Usually the abstract is kind of like the master overview, And then each of the other overview paragraphs you pull and you emphasize different pieces. The abstract may be the only one that really touches on your limitations, future research, stuff like that. So here, you also want to make sure it reads like a roadmap, meaning that you tell people what to expect and you tell them in the order that they're going to receive it. So that way, if I'm getting a little confused in your paper, I can go back to the introduction and get a sense of, oh, that's where this piece fits in. Because again, you're building this logical argument, and so each piece needs to build on another piece. So it needs to really build up to a conclusion, and each piece should be there for a reason. This paper, especially if you go down to the 4 pages, it's short enough that you really don't need much fluff. And no matter how many times I tell students that on the front end, they don't seem to understand it until they've already written a lot of the fluff. And then you feel connected because you invested time in the fluff, but let go of the fluff. If it doesn't add directly to your argument, if you can't clearly say and explain why it should be there, let go of it. Cry a little, it's okay, but you gotta let go of it. Any questions about the introduction paragraph? And this one should be broad. This isn't like, introduce me to all your article friends. It's still, you're just kind of saying in broad terms. You often, so I say to avoid using citations here. You don't need to tell me the studies, just sort of tell me the themes and the basic points you're gonna go through. And then after the literature review, there's you need a paragraph. Just to kind of introduce the literature review. For some of you, it's very brief. It's just sort of restating the main themes. For others, this may be a good place to give some background information, sort of what you need, almost like the ground rules. This is what you need to understand before I can tell you the important things from my themes. If it's really essential to introduce your studies, this paragraph would be the place that you do it. But again, remember, this is not a serial book report. When I say a serial book report, I mean you're telling me about study A, study B, study C, and then telling me something at the end. That's not what this paper is. This is meant to read more like the articles that you're reading, which is where you are making points and using citations. So you're making points based on the studies, and you're putting together this logical argument. Normally, you would have a lot more than 3 or 4 citations for this, so it makes more sense when you have 20 citations like your articles do, but this is meant to be a place where you learn how to do it. So it's a little artificial, and that can be hard sometimes because it is so artificial, but it's also very short. You really only need 1.5 pages to 2 pages of literature review. So the themes, again, I saw some issues with themes. They should be bold, uppercase. You don't need to actually include the word theme, just kind of whatever your heading would be. And it's a good idea to keep them fairly short. I would say 4 to 5 words is about the max. Themes are usually more like 1, 2, 3, somewhere in that range. Just to kind of break up the paper, and I'm sure you noticed as you were reading the other one, the themes really helps you know, okay, it's shifting now. Because usually, how many of us really read with 100% of our attention? We almost never do. And so having those little signposts really helps the reader. Just like in your papers, in the articles you were reading, having these signposts really help. And so one thing I didn't talk about too much before, because it's more of like a writing thing, but I did give it in terms of feedback, bless you. Every paragraph should start with a topic sentence. One sentence that's not really one of your points. It's just kind of an overview. It's sort of like, this is the reason I'm including this paragraph. And now I'm going to go through and tell you everything. When I write, I tend to find that whatever I write as my last sentence usually makes a really good topic sentence. And so after lots of feedback from my professors, I learned to start, I write my draft, whatever, and then when I go back through, I usually tend to move that last conclusion sentence up into an introductory, like a topic sentence. So that's something I find helpful. You can also, for all of this writing stuff, you can find a lot of helpful guides online. There's a ton of resources for writing out there. It's just about accessing them. Each paragraph should get at least one citation, and you should cite as soon as you use the source. So really, so your topic sentence probably isn't specific enough to have a citation. But within 2 to 3 sentences, I should see a citation in every paragraph. Because the whole idea is that you're not telling me general knowledge, you're not telling me your opinion, you are crafting an argument using these sources. And so you're going to use paraphrases. So it's almost like you're pulling quotes, but instead of pulling the quote, you're putting it into your own words, whatever the article said or found. And then within a paragraph, you should cite, normally I would cite, if you're just using one source in a paragraph, I would cite it 2, maybe 3 times. If you're using multiple, just cite every time you switch. And you should have at least, because again, it's not a serial book report, you should have at least a few paragraphs with multiple citations where you're integrating the information from multiple sources. And usually you'll have between 2 and 4 paragraphs on a theme. If a theme is much more than a page, you're probably taking up too much space with that one theme. Yeah?
I have a question for some of my themes have acronyms in them. Should I be writing the thing fully out, or should I use it?
So for acronyms, and for those of you who use them, I gave you comments that kind of explain a little bit and gave a reference. With an acronym, if you're going to use an acronym, you introduce the full term once. After that, in parentheses, you put whatever acronym you're going to use. And from that point forward, for the entire paper, you have to use the acronym every time. So in that case, I would go ahead and use the acronym. I'm not positive that that's right, but that's what seems like it would be APA style to me. If you look online and find a reference that's find something official seeming that says differently, just send me that and do whatever that says. Yep, and there were a few of you, so for really common things like PTSD, ASD, I tended to say, go ahead and use this, just make sure you're using it correctly. For some that are less common, I said, well, just go ahead and write it out every time, because it makes it easier for me as a reader. And you'll notice the articles that use lots of acronyms, they're just harder to pay attention. Even when you know what the acronyms mean, it's just harder to process the information.
So write out the common ones, and use that for the common ones and write out the non-common ones.
Exactly. And it depends, within your field, there might be a lot of things that are more common when you're more familiar with it. Basically, so on your paper, I would have given feedback about what to leave in and what to change. If I said it was okay to use, it's okay to use. And things like that I didn't really take off points for because that's a level of detail that we didn't get into. So I just, it's that's just something I'm going to tell you what to do, and now as long as you do it for your final draft, everything's fine. Any other questions about the themes and the headings? Okay. One thing I noticed some people, and I'm probably not going to ding you really for this, some people kind of had 2 very different themes, and they never really integrated those 2 together as a whole. To get a really, really high-scoring paper, you have to be able to integrate it all into one big thesis. And so it's okay to have these 2 different pieces. At some level, I'm telling you, break it into 2 pieces. But make sure that you're, at some point, bringing them together and saying, what do these 2 pieces mean together? Is anyone not sure what I mean by a serial book report? Or how to avoid that? Along those lines, I'll talk a little bit about quotes. So there are specific guidelines. I don't know if it's written here, but when we go through the rubric, I'll show you there were guidelines saying no more than 3 short quotes. In APA style, short means fewer than 40 words. Or 1 long quote, which is 40 words or more and needs special formatting. I recommend just avoiding 40 words or more so you don't have to figure out the formatting. Unless you have special permission, which is usually because you have lots of quotes from people, like participants in the study. And especially if you use lots of short quotes, those tend to add a lot. And so I'll usually give you a freebie for that one. But I was surprised. I had put a pretty clear guideline, and I still was surprised at how many papers I got that used a lot of quotes. So make sure, one thing is, I think part of it is not feeling confident, feeling like you need to use the quote to make the point. But the whole idea of writing this kind of paper is that your citation is your backup. Using that citation is how you say, I didn't just pull this out of thin air. This actually came from a scholarly source. That's why it's important that you're using scholarly sources, especially peer-reviewed journal articles, because those are ones where other scholars have said, yep, this is good enough. So make sure that you're putting things into your own words. I get that this is hard to do. I'm very willing to help you with that. If you bring it to class, we can work on it as a class. If you email me, here was my quote, here's me putting it in my own words, is this okay? I will give you feedback on that. And if you come to office hours, I'll help you figure out how to put it in your own words. It's a skill that takes some time to develop. But it's unacceptable to have more than 3 quotes in your final paper. Anyone who goes over the limit for quotes, it's quite possible I'll just give you a 0 for the paper, because it's a pretty big deal. Because at that point, you're relying on other people's words too much. So unless I explicitly told you it's okay to use more than 3 quotes, make sure that you're not using more than 3 quotes. You may get a 0, you may get just 20 or 30% off. I'm not sure quite where it would fall. It would probably depend how many quotes more than 3 there are, but I actually do count because it's pretty important that you know how to do writing in your own words now, because especially if you're continuing in psych, the papers get bigger and more complicated. You have to write them on a topic within that class, which can be challenging depending on if it's a class that's not really your strength. So I want to make sure that you're really learning how to do it now. This is supposed to be sort of your foundation. Okay. Any questions about quotes? Okay. So the discussion, the first paragraph after the discussion is another overview paragraph. That means you're just kind of summarizing, because again, you told me in the abstract is meant to be standalone. So pretend like I didn't read the abstract, because it's meant to be a completely standalone document. So in your introductory paragraph, you told me what you were going to say. You said it in your lit review. And then in your discussion, the first thing you do is you remind me, what did you say? Now, if this was a research, like an empirical study, you would have to be reminding me what the basic premise of the study was and what the main results findings were. For this, you're just reminding me what your themes are. So again, it's going to read very similarly to your first paragraph. That's fine. Just tweak it a little bit so it's a little bit different, and it's good. If you do mention specific supports, you can cite them, but you don't need, for this paragraph, you should be making general enough points that you don't really need to cite them. Citations can be distracting at times. Some people, because it says discussion, this is where they discussed their articles, and I get where that comes from, but that's not what this section is. Your discussion, there were some people who their lit review was kind of shallow, and then this first paragraph was wonderful for a lit review. So discussion, you're just kind of summarizing, and then you're getting into this critical, you're critiquing them. So you're not just saying what they are and how they fit together, you're actually critiquing them. So first you start with limitations, which is what's wrong with your articles. And again, it's better to go theme by theme and talk about, for example, if you're talking about there's not enough age diversity, you want to then mention all the studies, bless you, that don't have enough age diversity. Next, you'll talk about maybe they didn't all use the same definition of this disorder. So for example, with autism spectrum disorder, if some people only use severe autism and others used anywhere on the spectrum, it's really hard to compare those. So you could talk about things like that. But you want to avoid that feeling, it feels really choppy when you say, this article did this, this, and this wrong. This article did this, this, and this. And for this paper, I'm actually not looking for you to do a super intense limitations. I'm looking for 2 to 3 well thought out limitations. So part of that sort of intensity might be the feeling that you have to name all the things under the sun, and that's just not true. I would rather see it be integrated and focus on 2 or 3 main points. And again, I'm looking for at least one critique that you thought of yourself. Often, an easy way to do that is to look at when you take the articles as a whole, what's a limitation? Like, well, all of them take place in the US. And it's fine if one study in the US is not a big deal, but when the entire literature is taking place in the US, then we don't know how it happens in other places. We don't know if we can generalize. So if you talk about it as a whole, that's an easy way to communicate to me, hey, this one's mine. Otherwise, I'm usually not too picky about this, but if it seems like so if it seemed really shady, I can look up your articles. I can look to see what limitations they name, and I could match them. I typically am not going to do that, but just to be aware, I'm looking for at least one of them to be your own. And you could do sub-themes if you want. Usually, though, this section is fairly short. I think I actually have it a little longer than it needs to be here. So you probably don't need sub-themes, but you can do them if you want to. Any questions about limitations? Most people did pretty well with limitations. So this next paragraph is the one that really kicks people's butts. I'm not sure why, but it is. So the practice applications. This is where you're trying to communicate how should this body of research affect what people are doing in terms of applications, in terms of practice, like actually out in the world, not just doing research, but actually being a counselor, being a teacher, being a social worker, being a nurse. And you can mention something about what parents or teens or whoever should do, but you want to stay focused as much as possible on 2 things. Number 1, your specific study. Number 2, professionals. So your specific studies, you're trying to connect it to the things you talked about. So if you were talking about social media and depression, how social media might contribute to depression, it wouldn't be appropriate to talk about broad, like what kinds of things are helpful for depression. Instead, you would talk about social media. So you might say, for example, therapists may want to encourage, or may want to ask depressed clients about their social media use and encourage them to consider limiting it, at least while they're still feeling depressed. Does anyone have an example where they're not really sure what the application would be? So this section feels doable? Okay. And again, this paragraph, you may not have citations, and it doesn't need to be terribly long, just a paragraph, 4 to 6 sentences, somewhere in that range. But it needs to have probably at least 2, or either 1 really complex suggestion, or about 2 or so ideas of what therapists or other people can do. And again, you don't have to think just counseling, but you want to be thinking professionals. This is meant to be, this isn't in a magazine. It's in a journal that professionals are reading. So it doesn't really do much help if you're saying just what, you could say therapists may want to tell parents to do such and such. Or like you see here, one of the examples I gave is encouraging the distribution of PSAs. So I'm really telling government officials, you should do PSAs about this. So the next paragraph is future research. And again, for this section, you want to be really careful on the headings. I had people who did the lit review just fine and then would gunk up some of the headings. And then doing a final scroll through, print it out if you need to. I find that printing out helps me a lot for doing a final read through. Try to catch any places where you have, check any of the squiggly lines. I tend to read this in Word, so Word gives you away to me, even if I wouldn't notice it. Check all of everything that's marked as grammar or spelling, because nothing says, I don't really care about this paper, like ignoring what your computer is telling you. So future research is where you're trying to say at least 2 suggestions of what future studies should do. And here you need to address the issues you raised in the limitations section. So and there's two ways to fix this. So if I gave you feedback that, hey, these two weren't really lining up, you can either change your future research section to address what you talked about in your limitations, or you could go back and change your limitations section to add in whatever it is that you suggested for future research. So I'm not picky about which way it goes, but I'm looking for consistency from one section to the next. So for example, if you said, well, there's not enough racial diversity, you would say, we should study this effect in more diverse samples, more racially diverse samples. It's not, I think people feel a lot of, at least to me, I know when I was an undergrad, I couldn't even imagine, like, how do you get new ideas for research? Now that I'm a researcher, I know that I have way more ideas for research than I could ever possibly follow. Because it all starts with just saying, well, what's wrong with this study? What doesn't this study tell us? And then we say, well, we should do another study to find that out. So it's not, it should be pretty straightforward. It should be research-based, just like this up here is practice-based. What should counselors and nurses and people in the real world be doing? And this one is, what should scholars and researchers be doing? Any questions about the limit or the future research section? Conclusion, granted, mine is super short because I kind of ran out of room. And I get it when you run out of room, but especially when you have space left to fill, it's kind of clear that you've just run out of steam. And for a very rough draft, I get it. But in terms of papers that you're turning into me for grading, I'm grading them on the assumption that they're going to be polished. So your conclusions, it should hit your main points again. It should look fairly similar to your introduction, but probably a little shorter than your introduction paragraph is. And be sort of, again, remind me, what do you want me to take away from this paper? This is your last chance to convince me of your argument or get me to actually remember it. Any questions about conclusions? All right, references. So again, this is a lot of formatting, making sure that it looks the same, that there's a hanging indent, meaning the first line is flush left and all the other lines are indented. Some people do it by entering down and doing a tab. You can also do it with your ruler up here. Sometimes you have to tell it to view the ruler. View ruler, and I think it's fairly similar on a Mac. You can also, if you go to paragraph, I know that's pretty small for you guys, but you can tell it to do a hanging paragraph. So like if I changed it to first line, it would look different. And then I come in, and I'm going to change it back to hanging now. I'm going to change it to hanging, and it's at a 1/2 inch. And so that's a way to have it do it automatically so you don't have to do it by hand. Make sure all the spacing is there, the capitalization. DOIs, you can do it either way. Oh, why did this one actually... Oh, this is weird the way that... So I just happened to choose one that does have a DOI. So I wasn't really big on this from the beginning, so I'm not going to be too fussy for this class. But for future reference, I didn't realize that if you can't find a DOI, you should still give some sort of permanent link to the journal article. By permanent link, I mean don't just do the one that your web search came up with, because that's probably not the permanent one. Or like, don't just do what came up in PsycInfo, but instead do a search like, bless you. Does someone have part of a study name that they can tell me? Part of an article?
A holistic approach to preventing and treating depression.
To preventing?
And treating depression. I couldn't find a video like this.
Yep.
Xing,
What is it?
Xing.
So we couldn't even find a link to it?
Nothing. And it's weird because it was in 2010, so it's like more recent. It's like not that it wasn't even alive.
That is weird. So we'll pretend that it's one of these. And so you just want to find a link, like here it says phytotherapy, whatever that is. Phytotherapy research. So this would be the kind of thing you would want to do because it's a link. You can copy it here. If I opened, let's say I opened Safari, so a completely different browser that wouldn't have it in its history, and I typed it in, it'll come up. So that's the kind of permanent link you use if you can't find a DOI number. But you should always look for a DOI number first. And again, I didn't really emphasize this at the beginning, and so I've been just kind of, I don't know. But crossref.org is the best database to go to find things. So that's usually when I'm checking for a DOI, this is where I check. If I don't find it in here, then I don't penalize you for it. But if I can find it in here, and you can see I just typed in the title and it came up. Sometimes it helps to type in an author's name too. And here it gives you the DOI number. So crossref.org is the best place to go. If you can't find one for this class, I'm not being too fussy because it's kind of something I'm adding on at the end. But for any future classes that might be listening to this recording and for future classes you're in, the proper thing to do is to put the full permanent link. If you lost points on one of your references, check all the spaces, even little things like, so you need to be consistent. You can do either this hyperlink DOI, or you could do like, oh, that's not gonna let me. You could do like the DOI space. You wanna make sure your D stays uncapitalized, and you wanna make sure there's no space between the colon and the 10. So if you lost points, look for even little things like that. Because again, that's about having your paper being polished and following basically all the requirements. Any questions about the reference list? Okay. So I'm going to briefly go through the rubrics. So some of it is just things like your margins, your typeface, line spacing, alignment and indenting. These are things where if there's a mistake anywhere in the paper, I just take off the point here. So anytime you see a 0 over here in the column, look through your paper carefully to find the mistake. If you can't find it, you can come to office hours. I have opened up some office hours on Thursday also, so I have some tomorrow, some Thursday, and I can meet over distance, probably like Thursday late afternoon and Friday. Title page, abstract, and really this, it's telling you what to do for things. Keywords, a lot of people didn't quite get the keywords right, which I get. It's a weird little formatting thing. It's not terribly hard. It's just about having an example, having your paper, having them side by side and making sure that they look the same in a detailed way. The body of the paper, the different subheadings, discussion, subheadings for discussion, and conclusions. Most of this is just about having your headings correct. This, again, the idea is that this first part of the template focuses very intensely on APA style, because that's a big part of what this paper is supposed to help you learn. Reference page, I get pretty specific. And the reference page, I try to go 1, 2, 3 based on just how your list is. For citations, let's see. Actually, I think this one I probably didn't enforce very well when I was grading, because I know I gave more comments than I gave zeros. So this one, I tried to kind of estimate citation 1, citation 2, citation 3 or more. I'll probably switch the way I do this for future classes, just because it got a little hard for me to indicate to you where the problem was. Usually if there was a problem with one, there was a problem with multiple. And I would occasionally flag this is an example of a mistake, but make sure you go through carefully. This is one where there's not a required peer review, but it's probably a good idea to reach out to somebody from class and say, hey, do you want to just print out our papers, get together one night, and just kind of go through each other's? Because at some point, you've looked at your papers so much, you don't even see it anymore, nor do you want to. And so it can be helpful. And again, I use a screen a lot, but I find for this final editing stage, there's nothing like paper. I've had other people, I know for the APA test, I've had some people say it was much easier to find mistakes on a screen. So that may be starting to be a generation gap where you may find things easier on the screen. It's up to you. If nothing else, it's also just kind of different than the way you've been looking at it. So it's my recommendation. Quotes, so if it's 40 words or greater, you have to have a special style. I recommend just cutting it down because it's not worth learning the special style, in my opinion. Make sure that you have quotation marks, page number, and punctuation correct. And if you just Google quotes in APA style, there's a ton of tutorials. Also, as a reminder, Dr. Ling has a series of videos that go through how to format APA style. And I am happy to answer specific questions. So I'm not going to sit down and go through a paper, editing line by line with you, because that's just unmanageable for a whole class, for 3 sections of the class, actually. But if you have specific questions, especially if you come in and you have a list of even 10 questions written down, we can move through those pretty quickly. And I'm happy to do that. And then some of it's just about writing style, no contractions at all. And I would just do a search for like an apostrophe to check if you have any contractions in there. No use of I, me, my, you, your. This one, actually, this is an old version. It says they, them, their. I've updated it to say we, us, our. So talking about they, like the authors or the participants, that's perfectly fine. In fact, I encourage you to do so. But don't use self-centered words, I guess. First-person kind of words. Focus on that third-person approach. And it's okay to use one, to use, a generic like children, whatever, or parents or therapists. No use of article titles. So you never need to introduce the title of your article. It should always just be you're making your point and you're citing the authors. The closest you would get to doing something like this is sort of like the next one, talking about the authors and their work. So you would say like Smith and West studied autism in children or whatever. And so you would just use that as you would talk about the authors and what they did. The article is not really what you're talking about. Instead, the article is just documenting the work that they did, and you're citing that work. Does that make sense? Sort of. So again, it's kind of like we're bringing you into this professional field, and you're talking about what your colleagues are doing. And so you're talking about their work. Because if you do go into research, it really doesn't take very long in your teeny tiny corner of the world to get to know the people who you're citing. I know several of the people that I cited in my dissertation. Trying to think, I don't think I've roomed with any of them yet, but I know several of them. And then I just give a bonus point for spelling, just to round it out to an even 100. Any questions about the APA piece? So here's a really important point. I believe it is reasonable to expect for each of you to have a perfect APA rubric. And so if there is anything that is still a 0 on your final paper, that'll be remember I have that percentage where I'm saying how well did you address the things you need to address. If you have anything less than a perfect on the APA rubric for your final paper, I'm going to be deducting some of that percentage because it's very mechanical, right? If you put the time in, you'll get it right. If you use the resources online, on campus, with me, again, as long as you bring a list of questions, you can come to office hours. I have no problem. You can come in groups. You can do whatever. And we can also go over some questions. We can spend part of Wednesday's class time going over stuff. But This is all just about mechanics. This isn't about how good of a writer you are, how well you understood your articles. This is mechanics. And I believe that everyone in here is capable of getting 100 on their final. All right. The writing. So I'll talk a little more about the writing. Part of this is going to be repetitive of what I said about the template. So the abstract, I'm looking for it to be a very complete overview, so it should be the most complete of all your overview paragraphs. I'm looking for it to really be a snapshot of your whole paper. A good way to make sure that you've gotten all the points is to also talk about sort of the limitations and things at the end. But make sure it's meaty, that it's 150 to 250 words. If you're much less than that, that means that you're not giving the level of detail I'm expecting. Introduction, it should be sort of one paragraph addressing the topic and main idea. So you're kind of telling me basically what is this about. It needs to have an original thesis statement, and I should be able to find that thesis statement pretty easily. It should be a very clear statement that is encapsulating the whole paper. It's usually a slightly longer sentence because it's a little more complex. It might even be kind of like a two-part sentence, which is fine, but it needs to state the topic and an assertion. It's sort of like pick a side. You're making some sort of claim about this in one sentence. And then it also needs to have a roadmap for the rest of the paper. The most stereotypical, acceptable introduction would just kind of do these in order. It would first introduce the topic and the main idea in a sentence, a couple sentences, whatever. Then it would have a clear thesis statement, and then it would walk me through the points that you're going to make to support that thesis statement. Make sense? So that's the best introduction. For the body, this first one, I'm going to get rid of it for future classes. This first, yes?
The thesis statement doesn't have to be the last sentence of the introduction.
It does not. It's honestly probably better in the middle because again, it's not a surprise ending. You're telling me what you're going to tell me, and then you're going to lay out, this is my plan, this is what I want to do, this is my plan for how I'm going to get you there. This is what I want to convince you of, and these are the steps I'm going to take you through. So it's a different kind of writing than what you may be used to. It's very different from creative writing, and that doesn't mean you can't be an interesting writer while you do this, but it's just a very different purpose, and so you need a different approach. So the body, this first one is kind of whatever, but you need to make sure that each element supports and develops the main idea. So you have these themes that support whatever your thesis is, and you need to make it very clear how each one contributes. That's part of the work. You're laying the groundwork in the introduction, and you're following through in the body. And then each paragraph, I guess I do have it in here somewhere. So this is where it talks about a clear topic sentence, and it logically leads to, so the paragraphs feel connected. It's not just I copied and pasted this, I copied and pasted this. You're crafting a story, you're crafting almost a narrative to make these points, and you're really guiding me each step of the way. Make sense? Everybody still with me? So the discussion, you're going to have the one paragraph to summarize the main argument, and then I'm looking for you to have original critiques of the author's methodology. That means how they did the study. That includes participants. It includes the measures they chose. It includes how they picked the participants and interpretations. I'm not really putting a lot of pressure on you guys at this point to be able to critique their interpretations. I think that's a higher level skill. I think that's the kind of thing that you learn in experimental or in, as you keep moving through. But that would be where you're saying, okay, the data says this. You're telling me it means that. And I don't believe that I don't believe your conclusion follows from your data. I don't think your data actually supports what you're claiming. Those are the kinds of critiques. Right now, if you guys are getting through the articles and can critique the methodology, I, for one, am completely satisfied. But I want you to know that there's other kinds of critique out there that you'll learn how to do before you leave the program. And then original suggestions for application and research. So this is about you doing original critiques rather than just trying to copy. And again, I'm looking for at least one original that's well done. Conclusion should be a fairly full paragraph. You should be summarizing the body, wrapping things up. It needs to feel like a thorough conclusion though, not just you slapped a couple sentences on the end. It should be, again, another version of that master overview paragraph. Support for claims is about, so claims being well developed and supported, meaning that you're using evidence from your studies. And this doesn't mean quotes, this means just you're clearly kind of sticking to what the studies are talking about. It makes sense what you say, and you're using citations appropriately. Clear and concise, this is one that very few people will get a 10 on, just because I'm seeing how far are you coming toward learning how to write clearly, how to cut out unnecessary words, how to be direct. Active voice usually helps. Sometimes it's helpful to try to correct each other's sentences because, again, it's hard to start to get unstuck from the way that you usually write. And this is another thing. If you send me a sentence and say, I have no idea what to do with this one sentence, can you show me? And I'll give a couple examples of what you could do. Now, if you do that for 10 sentences, I'm not going to do all 10. But if you come, or if you bring someone to office hours, we'll work together. I'll try to help you build the skills. When I talk about that percentage of improvement, APA, I'm saying I really want to see everybody at 100 out of 100. For these, I'm looking to see, did you improve? Did you move yourself a couple clicks down the line? Did you improve your score by at least a point or two? So I'm looking for effort. Emphasis, so this is basically, are there a couple points that clearly stand out? Or are you just throwing, is it kind of like you threw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and saw what stuck and left all of the spaghetti in your lit review and then talked about a couple things in your conclusion? So I want to see that it's clear what points you're making. And again, remember, I don't really care whether your paper is 4 pages or 5 pages. So if you got a really low score for things like clear and concise and emphasis, you may want to try to cut down a little bit, especially if I told you the content's okay, but it's not very clear, or it's not well emphasized, you say, well, maybe I have some extra details in here that don't need to be. Logical development, this links to that idea of those topic sentences and setting up one paragraph for the next. Does it feel like it flows? Does it make sense as a whole? And is it easy to follow? Versus, do I have to jump around? Do I have to go back to the intro a lot to try to figure out where on earth we are? Do I get surprised, like, wait, you're talking about this, I didn't know you were going to talk about this? And so it's about making sure that the paper the abstract introduction, those overview paragraphs, actually match the paper that you ended up writing. Because remember, some of that tends to change as you're writing, which is why I always suggest write those overview paragraphs last. Make sure that you lock down what you want to say. Style is sort of basically how well are you sounding like an academic, which is formal without being wordy or affectation. Affectation is where you're sort of unnaturally trying to sound, usually you're trying to sound smarter than you are. And by smarter than you are, I just mean you're using words that you may not really completely understand or that don't fit with the rest of your voice, but you're just trying to build in a few big words. I'm not really too fussy about how precise of words, as long as you're not saying a lot every other sentence or slang. I'm looking more for straightforward, professional sounding writing. The kind of writing that you might submit for like a newspaper article. And that this is a little bit also about sort of just how well you're writing, a fluency of expression, meaning it's easy for me to understand. You can express yourself really well in writing. And is it a variety? Does it feel, because when you have the same sentence over and over, it tends to feel really choppy if they're short or really hard to interpret if they're long. And so I'm also looking kind of like, if you were going to submit it, let's say for peer review, if you wanted to publish it, or if you were going to use it for a writing sample. Lots of grad programs, including our master's programs in counseling, ask you to submit a writing sample. If you were going to use this as a writing sample, how much more work would you need to do? And so I'm looking for it to be at least good enough that you could submit it proudly for a writing sample. It may or may not be actually your best piece of work by the time you apply for these programs, but I want it to be at that level. That's kind of what I'm thinking. And then writing mechanics, this is sort of the run-on sentence, sentence fragments, punctuation, using words correctly. And this is also where I get into, I specifically look to see if I see things that are obvious spelling errors that are left, that's not going to be so good. So one of the things I'm seeing is just, did you at least do a basic check for whether it was correct? APA style manual does discuss in depth things like grammar, spelling, punctuation. I'm not expecting you to know them, but that's the grammar authority I'm using, I guess. And so these are actually 11 sections out of 10 points each. So you get kind of like a little bit of cushion to start with, because you can lose 10 points and still have a perfect score for this section. That means that kind of frees me up to grade pretty honestly, because I know that there's a little bit of cushion left for the fact that you are, in a 200 level class. So then what I do is I average those two scores. You get a writing score from this section. You get an APA score, which should be 100 for the final one. I add them together, divide by 2 to get an average. Then I check to see, did you submit it correctly? And I think everybody got all those points. And then I do, did you have the correct formatting? That I probably didn't deduct quite as many points for this one as I will for the final one. If there's issues with things like headings, formatting means kind of APA style. Did you have the right margins? Did you have not extra spacing between lines? So I'm going to be a little more nitpicky on the final version for this one and for just other versions moving forward. And then is the total, this says 8 to 10. Again, this is an old version that I pulled up. It's 7 to 8 is what the total should be. And I had a few people who went over and lost points for it. So if you go over or under, you'll lose some points. Because you have 2 pages. You can get it somewhere within that 2-page. And then it has all the sections that you've included every section, including like the introduction paragraphs to things. And then finally, I'm saying, so theoretically, if you got full points for your first draft, which no one did, you would just automatically get this. But basically, I'm deciding how well did you address all the feedback. Now, if you got a lot of feedback, feel free to, after you've read through it a couple times and you've done the easy stuff, feel free to come in with the harder stuff and say, which of these do I prioritize? Because realistically, it's tough to turn around a really rough paper into a great paper. So you can come in and talk with me about how do I prioritize these different comments. And again, I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking to see progress. And if you had, 20 comments to address and you made progress on 18 of them, I'm probably going to be pretty happy with that. It's papers are case by case, and this is sort of everything else I try to stick to a rubric to make sure it's as uniform as possible, my grading across different papers. But this is the one where I get to kind of just say, wow, you worked really hard on that, or you more or less turned in the same paper this time that you turned in last time, even though I gave you a lot of feedback. And so these 3 things get averaged out again. So I'm averaging out the points, I'm averaging out the percentages. Again, most people should get 100 on this one and 100 on this one. So that softens the blow of whatever percentage I assign here. So I average out those percentages, and then you get your total points times your total percentage. So if your total percentage ended up being 90%, and your points according to the rubric would be 90 points, your final score would be like an 81. What questions do you have about the paper now? Yeah.
In terms of improving our logical development,
Mm-hmm.
just like maybe think about switching around themes or something? Because I've been reading my paper a lot of times, I have a 5 out of 10 on logical development. I don't know how to improve it other than like rewriting the paper.
So for logical development, it doesn't necessarily mean that your themes are bad or that the order is bad. It's more that you're not explaining the order to me. So as a reader, you need to explain to me what you're doing. So it may make sense, you just have to explain it to me how it makes sense. So that's things like making sure that it's building toward a point, or if you have kind of 2 separate pieces that you're trying to marry together, sometimes you're just trying to stretch a little bit, but try to explain some rationale of why those 2 points are both important to take together. Things like checking for topic sentences, checking to make sure you're really having a flow from one section to another. That's a good question about logical development. What other questions? All right. I don't know how to stop this now. There we go.